Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Kalayim, Pedic Aleph, Halacha Tes. We're going to be learning today Daf Ches. And we left off Mamish all the way on top of the Amid. We left off with a discussion linking the Machloikes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon regarding a Davar She'einoi Mischaven. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's Asur. Rabbi Shimon holds that it's Mutar Legamrei. And as we spoke out a case, or even where there's a psikresha, if it's loy ichbeslei, according to Rabbi Shimon, it will also remain mutter. That the Yerushalmi correlates this machlokes with the machlokes we had between the Chachamim and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tadoi, regarding tiltul minatzad. Rabbi Elazar Tadoi holds that tiltul minatzad is not called tiltul. Our Gemara says that's because Rabbi Elazar subscribes to the shita of Rabbi Shimon that Davar She'eina Mischaven is completely permitted. That is where we left off. Now the Gemara here, beginning on top of Daf Ches, will qualify. In other words, will limit the opinion of the Chacham of Rabbi Yehuda / Chacham versus Rabbi Shimon regarding dragging a chair when there is a possibility that it's going to make a furrow in the ground, even though, again, that's not your intent. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda says that it's prohibited. The Chachamim hold that it's prohibited. Midrabanan, we're going to limit it to dragging versus removing a chair that's already inserted in the ground. And the issue might be that making a hole in the ground is prohibited because of the malacha of boina. So if one will remove it, and then the hole that already was there will become exposed, whether that's considered a malacha or not, we can argue, yeah, you're exposing the hole, or the hole was there anyways. And we're going to first qualify the shita of Rabbi Yehuda and the Gemara on the way of challenging our understanding that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Shimon is going to bring in some very interesting halachas of Sfichei Shvi'is. Don't forget, one of the cases of our Mishnah is regarding burying vegetables in the ground on the Shemitah year. That's clearly the Mishnah saying that's not prohibited, even though one is not allowed to plant on the Shemitah year. The Gemara understands that there is another chiddush of our Mishnah, and that is what were to happen if that which you buried, lahatmana, actually grew. Whether there is an issue of Svichei Shvi'is, we're going to learn an interesting machlokes, Tanoim, Chachamim, and Rabbi Shimon, and all of that will challenge our understanding that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Shimon. That's going to be more or less the first topic of today's discussion, and we're going to then continue. We're going to then continue to learn and to focus on the seifa of our Mishnah of Halacha Tes, in which we had a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim hold, remember, Hazorei Achita Achas and So'era Achas Harei Zeh Kalayim. Rabbi Yehuda holds, no, for you to violate Kalayim, you have to plant at least 3 grains. And why is that? As we explained, because when the Torah says Sotcha lo yisizra Kalayim, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Sotcha doesn't mean a barren field. Sotcha means a field that is already planted, at least with 1 grain. Kalayim is taka also 1 and 1 from different species. Doesn't have to be more than 1 and 1. But there needs to already be a field, and for that you have to plant at least 3 grains. That will be the Mishnah. And the Gemara will introduce a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding, let me just share the words that we will have in the Rasharilio. Rabbi Yochanan holds that by Kalayim, Basar Netilosen La'aretz Azlinam. It's not about what your intent was, it's about what actually happened. In other words, where did they fall in the ground? We're going to explain that if these 2 seeds fell beyond a certain distance, it's not Kalayim, even though you intended for it, yes, to fall within the distance. But if it did not. Basad nefilasan oslinan, and a Shlakish is a lot more machmir, and he holds that basad yitziyasan mitachas yadoy oslinan, and if when you threw it from your hands, your intent was, as we'll see, for it to fall together, even if de facto it fell in a great distance, or if there was a fence and one fell on one side and one fell on the other side, according to the Shlakish, you will be potter. And we're going to bring that back to our Mishnah, and we're going to come with two very important nukodas. Nukoda number one is that when Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah argues with the Chachamim, the way we learned it correctly, Chachamim say 2 seeds. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be a minimum of 3 seeds. Of course, each one from a different species. Really, Rabbi Yehuda is telling you 2 din. When Rabbi Yehuda says the words that Einoi Kalayim Achiyu Shnei Chitim Usoida Achas, etc., his words Einoi Kalayim is implying another argument he has with the Chachamim, and that is that, again, we're going to speak about distances. That there was a certain plantation that lechachamim, since they were within the distance, we'll see, of 6 tfachim, it is considered kalayim. Rabbi Yehuda argues with that. He holds that no, that in itself is not kalayim. And then he also argues regarding it has to be already a planted field, which is what we learned when we learned the Mishnah inside. In other words, we're going to have a discussion of the minimum distance. We will see that there is a biblical minimum distance of 6 tvachim. Midrabanan, we are a lot more machmir. They make a much larger distance. But all of that will be correlated to this argument that will begin today and will continue, God willing, in the next year between Rabbi Yechanan and Eshvakish. Again, Rabbi Yechanan holds that basar nefilasan azlinan, and Eshvakish holds basar yitziyasan mitachas yodoi azlinan. All right. Let's go right inside on Daf Ches. Daf Ches, all the way on top of the Amid. Says the Gemara, whether it's Rabba or whether we're going to follow our girsa of Rabbi Ba, which is Rabba, makes the following statement in the name of Rab Huna. Similarly, Rab Chagai makes the same statement also, b'shem Rab Ze'era. Thirdly, Rabbi Yosi, b'shem Rab Hila. That what? Now we're going back to the general machloikes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rab Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda here will be referred to as Shitas Chachamim, dragging a chair, a bench on the ground, which according to the Chachamim is asur midrabanan, because it's going to make a furrow, right? Or it might make a furrow. The key says that when you have a chair whose legs are already sunk into a muddied ground, in other words, there is already a hole in the ground. Let's remind ourselves, making a hole in the ground is asur midoraisa because of the malach of boinem. When you build, you got to make foundations, you make holes. Here the hole was in the ground, but it was not exposed. Will exposing the hole be a violation? Not a violation. These 3, Amayroim, Rav Huna, Rav Zeidam, Rav Hila, no. Shemuter letaltoloi. The word metaltoloi, just for the record, clearly doesn't mean, like the way the Marafulda says and everyone else says, doesn't mean to drag it. No, dragging, extending a hole, even though that's not your intent, that's the whole machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda Chachamim hold it's asur. Here we're speaking about letaltoloi vis-a-vis, removing it from the mud. Now, there is a nuance of a chiddush, because you can argue that when you remove something from the mud, you might make the hole a little bit bigger. That's already not something that we are concerned about. The main chiddush here is that it's not only we're not concerned that you're going to make the hole, you're going to make a new furrow, or you're going to make the hole bigger. The main nukuda is that creating of a hole is asur, exposing something that already is mutter. And furthermore, says the Gemara, ukema the teimar mutter lotalkaloi. Just like we are quoting from all these Amoraim, that we are allowed to remove it from the hole. That's what Lataltali means. Because you're not creating anything new. So now let's make a chiddush on top of that. With the Kavase, so following the same logic, Muta lahachziroi, you are allowed to return the chair to exactly the same hole from which it was removed. In other words, here again, we are not concerned that the hole will be enlarged. Don't forget, we're speaking about mud, which, again, there are, according to some of the commentators, there is a greater suspicion, a greater fear, because, right, mud is liquidy. We don't have that suspicion. Since the hole was there before, you are allowed to you are allowed to return it. Okay. Says the Gemara, I'll prove you from our Mishnah this concept that exposing a hole that's already present is not a problem. Amar Rabbi Yosef, good gesagt, and ufnan taninan. It's like hachim nami taninan tanan, and I can prove the same from our Mishnah. Let's remind ourselves what's the ratio of our Mishnah. It's about removing a turnip or a radish, right? The Hilchah Shabbos part from the ground. Here again, removing it from the ground, we were only focusing on the muktzah issue. I got that. Tiltul min atzad. Maybe it's not even tiltul min atzad. Maybe it's Rab Shimon. Doesn't matter. But there's another issue. When you had something only buried for storage, but when you had a turnip, you had a radish, so it created a hole. When you remove it on Shabbos, you are exposing the hole. Gavaldik. So we learned in our Mishnah that nitolen b'Shabbos is araya, right? Forget about the issue of tiltul min atzad, of the offer that's muktzah. A bigger issue, you're making a hole. No one is concerned about that. Is araya, this concept that if a hole is already present, exposing it is not part of the problem. That's a great proof, right? Says the Gemara, I have no proof. Why is there no proof? And now the Gemara is going to do something that will be challenged. Let's go back to the whole concept of Malacha She'ein Tzricha Lagufa. Don't forget that these three Amiroim that we started today's share with, right? B'Shem Rav Huna, B'Shem Rav Ze'eda, B'Shem Rav Hila, they were telling you a chiddush b'shitas chachamim. According to Rav Shimon, who holds that when you do an act and your intent is not for the malach, like for example, you have a turnip in the ground, you want to eat it. Your intention is not to make a hole. You don't want the hole. You don't care about the hole. According to Rav Shimon, it's not problematic. Not only not midoraisa, not even midrabanan, because it's davar she'enim eschavit. Here again, l'chayda, right? Abaye v'Rava moedet Ravayu, that even Rav Shimon holds that psikresha, that it's vitally problematic. Again, we're going to go with the shita that when it's loy ich bislei, these were the words that we are using. It's also not a problem. So maybe our Mishnah follows Rav Shimon. Creating a hole, exposing a created hole is a problem. The only reason why it's permitted is because it's unintended. So therefore, you can't bring an ayah from our Mishnah. So this refutation of the proof is by saying that our Mishnah follows Rav Shimon, and the Gemara right away is going to challenge that. Whoopa, don't tell me our Mishnah is Rav Shimon. Can't be. This is Gavaldik. Why is that? Because v'hataninon shvi is one of the dinim that the Mishnah gave, right in Halacha Tes. The Mishnah was very vague. Is that when you bury something, not for it to take root, but yes, for you to store it there, lahatmana, it doesn't touch the problem of Shemitah. And when we learned the Mishnah, we emphasized the basic law. One is not allowed to plant on the Shemitah year. Zok the Mishnah that if you're putting it in the ground to bury it, to storage, keep it fresh, or to keep it away from people or animals that you don't want for them to eat of it, it's not a problem even on the Shemitah year. That's correct. There is another part of Shemitah. And as we mentioned, that other than for the din of Shabbos, where if it grew de facto, that was not your intent, but if it took root, if it began to grow, you may not remove it on Shabbos because you're doing an act of koitzah. When it comes to the other dinim of the Mishnah, we are allowing for whatever it is that we are speaking about to happen, even if it grew. So now let's speak about something else. What happens if something grew on the Shemitah year? We're calling that svichei shvi'is, after growths. All right? Is it a problem? A problem meaning, are you b'chal allowed to eat svichim? So we are going to quote now a interesting machloikas that we have in Masechta Shvi'is in the 9th chapter between the Chachamim and Rab Shimon, that the Chachamim hold that svichim are prohibited to be consumed. All right, we're speaking about whether it's doiraisa, the Rabbanan, we just had that machloikas in the previous Masechta, it's Rabbi Akiva and everyone else. But on a rabbinic level, for sure, you may not consume svichim. And you have the unique opinion of Rab Shimon that holds, quoting the words of Rab Shimon, kol hasvichim mutarim chutz mikruv. Now, if our Mishnah would follow Rab Shimon, this is all part of the question. That Rab Shimon matir b'svichei shvi'is. And yet the Mishnah says that the only reason why we're not concerned with shvi'is is because your intent was lahatmana. Which implies that if one would have planted the radishes, the turnips, not lahatmana, if you would have planted it lahashrasha, if you would have planted it for it to grow, then it would be asar on shvi'is. And by the way, lachachamim and lachanami. But now that you're trying to say that our Mishnah cannot bring a proof to the din that we began our share with, because perhaps our Mishnah follows Rab Shimon, how can you even entertain the fact that the Mishnah follows Rab Shimon? The Mishnah implies that the heter of shvi'is is only because it's lahatmana. If it's lizriya, it would be asr. It's not true. According to Rab Shimon, like we just mentioned, of course you're not allowed to plant anything on the Shemitah year, but if you did and something grew, Rab Shimon holds kol hasvichim mutarim. Wow. So answer is the Gemara. I'll still tell you that our Mishnah follows Rab Shimon. When you plant it, it's asur mitzat svichim. True. Afal gav de Rab Shimon matir b'svichei shvi'is. But there is another din of Shemitah, all aside of the din of planting itself, and that is that islay mishum kedusha shvi'is. Right, when something grows on the Shemitah year, so it's bound, it's limited. Right, you can't do schaya with it. You can't take it out of the Holy Land. You can't consume it after that item is no longer available in the fields. In that Medina, part of the Holy Land, l'chayis basada v'chulei. So what we're saying over here is that if someone planted turnips or radishes, not planted, they placed it in the ground for storage, even if it grew, it won't have kedusha shvi'is. Excuse me. Eino choishes, lo mishum shvi'is, v'lo mishum kedusha shvi'is. And bottom line is our Mishnah could follow Rab Shimon. I want to just conclude with one thing before we go on to the next part of the Mishnah. Our Mishnah doesn't have to be Rab Shimon. That's why there was a novelty by Amar Rabbi Yosef Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabun. It was a novelty that he said our Mishnah is Rab Shimon. We could learn our Mishnah. Our Mishnah follows the Chachamim. I just want to clarify something. But hold on. If our Mishnah follows the Chachamim, how are you allowed to remove the radishes from the leaves on Shabbos? What about tiltul min atzad? So I want to say that that's what we pointed out yesterday, perhaps at least, that if you don't lift the earth, it's not even called tiltul min atzad. Okay, moving on. So the second part of the Mishnah, the latter part of the Halacha Test Mishnah, was the machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Again, the Chachamim oimrim hazrei achito so'ira achas harei zeklayim. And Rabbi Yehuda comes along and explicitly argues with one point by saying, no, that you have to be a zoireya 3 grains. Remember, either 2 chitim in one so'ira, 2 so'irim in one chita, or chita so'ira kusemes. Why? Because the satcha, there has to be already something planted for it to be considered a field. Says the Gemara, here comes the big machlokes, and we have to remember this. For God, this is going to go into the next stuff as well. Let's go. Zora shnei minei bika. A person is planting 2 seeds in a bika. In a bika means in an unfenced area in which nothing is planted as of yet. Or if you plant 2 seeds in a churva again means in a location which is not fenced off and there's nothing else there. Why is this important? This is mamish gavaldik. We're going to follow the way the Rash Sedilio understands this Gemara, similar to Satcha, that the prohibition of planting kalayim is only if either you planted it in an enclosed area. We're going to continuously have the words in Rash Sedilio. He calls it afalpi, that ein kan chavisha. Chavisha means it's not enclosed. And when I say enclosed, guys, either it means with a fence, proper walls, not a churva that's all broken open, or just for the record, when you plant something in a field, fields were not fenced off necessarily so, but it's surrounded by a plantation. So if I plant in a wheat field, if I plant a so'oida, for sure that is kalayim because I planted it in an enclosed area. Bika means nothing was planted there as of yet. It's not enclosed with a fence. Same thing as with a churva. So Bekitzer, you're planting it in a place where even if you have two different zerayim, you're not violating kalayim. It's not in the sot. Or now comes the other part. What happens if you are intending to plant it in an enclosed area? Happens to be that when you threw the two seeds, shnei minim, but v'chilkam gadek, they ended up landing one on each side of the fence. Unlike kilei hakerem that we keep on learning, you have to have 6 tvachim, you have to have 4 amas. By kilei zerayim, the primary issue is a maras ayin issue. And therefore, if it is on 2 sides of the fence, even mamish near each other, since a fence separates these 2 seeds, there is for sure no problem of kalayim. So let's focus primarily on the last case, Shnei Minim V'chilkam Gader. That's the way that Asherilio learns. On this, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Pater. Why is it going to be Pater? As we said the words before, because Bikalayim Basar Nifilosan La'aretz Azlinon, says that Asherilio, when they fell down de facto, they fell down each on a different side of the fence. Even though that was not your intent, it's not your Pater. Or when you threw it, even though you were intending, if we're going to learn that way, that it should fall not in a churva or not in the bika, you wanted it to fall within the planted grain field, and you threw 2 different types of seeds. It's not what your intent is what happened. However, and therefore he's lenient. However, Rav Shimon ben Lakish Amar, you're chayiv. Why you're chayiv? Using the words of the Rashirilio, the basar yitziyasan mitachas yadoi lezoidon azlinon. It's what happened when it left your hand. When it left your hand, in these cases, your intent was for it to go in a place where it would have been prohibited. Even if it didn't turn out that way, you're going to be chayiv. Wow. Now the Gemara is going to limit the stringency of Reish Lakish. Says the Gemara. Either if you intended for it to be planted, either al gaba hayam means you threw it into the sea. You can't plant in the sea, right? Let's say you threw it into the sea, and the wind blew it and it fell onto land. Or al gaba pitra. Pitra means a rock hard soil, or on top of rocks. So it's not soil on rocks themselves. Or al gaba tirashim, some sort of rough terrain that's not allowing itself to have anything planted there. That if this was your intent, even Reish Lakish holds Shu Pater Gavaldik. In other words, yes, he holds Basar Yitziyasan Mitachas Yadoi Ozlinon. But Basar Mitziyatzai Mitachas Yadoi is what was your intent. Furthermore, Moeded Rav Shimon ben Lakish that Bizoireya Al Minas Lachalkum Gader, that if you knew your aim was it should fall 1 seed on one side of the fence and 1 seed on the other. Similarly, you're going to be pater. In other words, you have to have kavanah for them to be together. Chiddush of Reish Lakish is that when this was your intent, even in the case where your intention did not come to fruition, which is why Rabbi Yochanan will say didn't happen. You know, you have kavanah to do a sin, but you did not sin. The Shlakish says that by kalayim, we say basar yitziyasa mitachas yada yoslinan. You intended to throw it on the same side of the fence. When it left your hand, there were 2 seeds, each one from a different type. So yeah, you're already chayiv. If the poil it fell on 2 sides of the fence, it does not undo the sin that you did, which was you intended and it left your hand as kalayim. That's a big machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Okay, says the Gemara that Chesam base that Amar Rabbi Ba from Katignoya, which is from Tunis, that Moide Rav Shimon ben Lakish le'inyan Shabbos We don't say Yitziyasin mitachas yadai. He's focusing on Yitziyah Shabbos. And as we learned in the beginning of the Masechta and throughout the Masechta, many chapters, that the violation of Hitza'ah is dafka both an Akira and a Hanacha. When are you chayiv ad shetanuach? You have to have the Hanacha. Unlike by Kilayim, that's the whole vart of Rav Shimon, that you are liable the moment the seeds left your hand. If we would focus on the Hanacha, well then, if it landed on two different sides of the fence, then you should be exempt. The Shlachah shows that you're chayiv. That's the unique din of Kalayim. We don't care where it landed. We care what was the intent when it left your hands. Says the Gemara. Okay, now that we have this, let's begin. Our Mishnah seems to disagree with the Shita of Rabbi Yechanan. And why is that? So we're focusing on the words of the Chachamim that say that Hazrei Achita Soira Achas. Look at the words in the Mishnah, right? It says, I'm reading inside the Gemara folder. The Perishis, Mi Damas Nisan Ke'achas. The Mishnah says Ke'achas. The words Ke'achas, right? That implies mashma shoitzian miyadoi Ke'achas. The issue is that once the Chita and the So'odai left your hand together, that's the understanding. The Ke'achas implies it was released from your hands, Ke'achas. And that contradicts Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan holds that you're, let's say, releasing the two seeds at the same time is not where you violate. You only violate if they land in an area that's subject to Kalayim. It's an enclosed area, either by a fence, on the same side of the fence, either within a grain field from another type. So that's the kash from the Ka'achas. And so the Gemara, I'll tell you what the Ka'achas means. It's not implying that it has to leave your hand Ka'achas, but it does imply something else. Answers the Gemara that Pasalah b'nesunim etoich shisha al shisha. In other words, it's about nefilasan ba'aretz, but where it has to be within a certain limit. And again, I just want to emphasize that the 6 tfachim limit, which we're saying that if two seeds fall beyond 6 tfachim one from the other, there is no kalayim. That's only midai raisa. The Chachamim gave a much more stringent shiur, as we'll see in a moment. The Amar Rabbi Yechanan ein chayiv achi yiu shishal shisha mekurachim b'toich stei tvuah or mukafin gader, like we keep on learning. That's the big thing that we're learning today, right? That it has to fall in some sort of enclosed area. Enclosed doesn't mean there has to be a physical fence. If you have a grain field, the grain field itself is like the fence. It's like an area. If it falls within that or within a mukafin gader, you're chayiv only when it's shisha al shisha. So the ka'achas means it has to be within close proximity. It's not a kash. The Gemara says, whoa. When we learn the words of Rabbi Yehuda, and I'm quoting the words of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, Einoi Kalayim, right? Ad, he writes, Sheyu Shnei Chita Mesoira Achas, Ushnei Soira Vechita Achas, or Chita Soira and spelled. When Rabbi Yehuda says the words Einoi Kalayim, those words were superfluous because to argue with the explicit din of the Chachamim, he says 2 seeds. But Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, that Achiyu, Shnei Chita Mesoira Achas would have been enough. When Rabbi Yehuda says the words Einoi Kalayim, we are understanding that Rabbi Yehuda is arguing with the Chachamim in 2 din. Din number 1 is, and let's go to what we just explained, the Ka'achas, that if it's within 6 tvachim, it's a problem. Meaning, says on that, says Rabbi Yehuda, I disagree with you. Even if it's within 6, I'm going to be more lenient. Einoi Kalayim. The other din that you're saying that it's 2 seeds are enough, I disagree with that also. Even if it's within a fenced-off area. If nothing else was yet planted there, if it's a grain field, but nothing was planted there, it's not called sap. So the words of Rabbi Yehuda, the opening words, Einoi Kalayim, implies that he's arguing with the shiur of the Chachamim. So says the Gemara, whoa, that doesn't work. Bahador Rabbi Yehuda Omer Einoi Kelayim. Look inside the Pnei Moshe. Look inside the Pnei Moshe. 4 lines into the widest lines. That Bahador Rabbi Yehuda Omer Einoi Kelayim. The Bitmiyah. The Ibn Nasun Min Echad B'Tech Shisha Al Shisha Shal Min Ha'achar Mighty. Right, which is what we are explaining with the implied ka'achas. Right, it shouldn't be a kashan Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan says basa nifilas and la'aretz asli. The word achas is mashma that what it's basa yitziyas and itachas yada. No. Ka'achas means it fell within 6 tvachim. If it fell within 6 tvachim, could Rabbi Yehuda argue with that? Rabbi Yehuda cannot argue with that. That within 6 tvachim is very close. Of course, Rabbi Yehuda will hold. And that Pnei Moshe is saying, "V'chi I got my palik Rabbi Yehuda b'loimer eino kalayim." So says Rab Ze'era, Rabbi Yehuda kedate. Yeah, that's correct. Rabbi Yehuda oimer v'stei yarek tefach. By the way, when he says stay yarek, it doesn't only mean vegetables. Rabbi Yehuda Taka has a more lenient shear. So you're right. So the ka'achas means within 6 tvachim. On that, Rabbi Yehuda says, I b'chlal disagree with the shear of 6 tvachim. It's only 1 tefach. And in addition, it has to be 3 grapes. Gemara says, hold on. I'm not gonna go with that. If that's your understanding, b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda. So this is the kasha on Rab Ze'era's understanding. I'm Rabbi Yossi, man, the boy makash alada the Rab Ze'era. If you want to refute Rab Ze'era, you'll successfully do so. Why is that? Because I can extrapolate Yolef Hadam, the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, right, regarding the shear of the gap. I can know it from what the Chachamim hold. Well, now let's go. Come on, the Rabbanan, just like that we know from the Chachamim. They hold, like we mentioned, the 6 tvachim. And if you're telling me that if it's beyond 6 tvachim, there's no kalayim, that's only midoiraisa. Mid Rabbanan, the shear is much larger. The shear is called the shear of Beis Reva. The Isur, to violate the rabbinic law, we know the Chachamim hold Beis Reva. Where do the Chachamim hold the shear of 6 tvachim? That's only to be chayiv malchus, which means to be chayiv doiraisa, turning to that pass. Kach Rabbi Yehuda Oimar. Rabbi Yehuda also agrees that at least mid Rabbanon, he also agrees to the 6 tvachim. The Isur Shisha al Shisha. We learned that Rabbi Yehuda says, he's quoting Rabbi Ze'era, the stay Yorek Tefach, yes, but the stay Yorek Tefach is only to be chayiv malchus. So Atkan, you can still, with this, we can still understand how Rabbi Yehuda's implied machlokes on the Chachamim, when he says the words Eina Kalayim, right? It fits. Eina Kalayim was 6 tvachim midoiraisa. I can refute all of that because we have the same din of our Mishnah quoted in a Braisa, Vehotani. In an Abraisa, we learned the words, Rabbi Yehuda is matir completely. Matir means that if it's outside the 6 tvachim, it's not even asur midrabanan. Look inside the top Pnei Moshe. When you read the words in the Mishnah, Eina Kalayim, again, that implies that he's arguing in addition to the 2 verses 3. But with the shiur, the ka'achas, haba matzina l'shanoi kidem shanei Rab Ze'era, that our Mishnah, the mighty sheish b'rich of tefach b'min l'min zeh. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, once it's beyond the tefach, at least you won't be chayiv malchus. It fits. Elo lamai the tani bebraisa. Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda is matir completely. Now that's not true. If it's beyond the tefach, but within the 6 tefachim, l'chu'ura Rabbi Yehuda will be moida. It's also midrabanan. Kashi. Do'amia yisura ika l'didei b'tekshi shal shisha kedamnina. V'amai tani bebraisa Rabbi Yehuda matir. That's the Gemara's kasha. Now it's amazing that when we have in the next word in the Gemara, vikashya, which is where we're going to start next year with, most learn that the word vikashya is a new kasha. But let's continue. The Pnei Moshe learns that the word vikashya is the end of the Gemara saying, I have no answer for that. Vikashya, koloimed, v'hakashya l'shanui. That will be hard to find the Rab Ze'era. We're back to the kasha. We're back to the kasha that we disagree that the ka'achas means within a certain shear, because we know that there is taka machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. The problem is that Rabbi Yehuda only argues with the Chachamim midoiraisa, but midrabanan The 6 tefachim is also going to be asur. So it will be a lot better to understand that the implied ka'achas is about leaving your hand together. All of that only fits with a shlokish that holds basar yitziyasa mitachas yodai. So now we're back to the original question. In other words, l'chu'ura, our Mishnah seems to imply that the issue of kalayim is not basar nifilasa ba'aretz, but it's yitziyasa mitachas yodai, and that we're leaving that question open. And next year we'll continue with another kasha that we will have regarding this machlokes.